She did not ask for a salary. She did not ask for a thank you. She gave up her apartment, her career, her relationship, and a full decade of the only life she had to make sure her mother did not die alone. And the morning after her mother took her last breath, her phone rang. It was not a condolence call. It was not a prayer. It was her brother, Martin, calling to ask about the house. That one phone call, made before the body was even cold, was the beginning of a betrayal so calculated, so quiet, and so deeply personal that it would eventually end up in a courtroom. And what that courtroom would uncover would shake everyone who thought they knew this family to their core. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you are new here, hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Stories like this one do not get told enough, and the people at the center of them deserve to have the truth spoken out loud. To understand what happened to Diane Patterson, you have to understand the kind of woman she was long before any of this began. Diane was not the flashy one in the family. She was not the one who moved to a big city or built a career that made people raise their eyebrows at family dinners. She was the steady one, the daughter who stayed close to home, who answered the phone on the first ring, who showed up without being asked. She had trained as a nurse, built a modest but stable life for herself in her mid-30s, and was, by most accounts, exactly the kind of person you would want in your corner when life got hard. And life was about to get very hard. Eleanor Patterson was 71 years old when the first fall happened. It was a Tuesday morning in late October. She was reaching for something on the top shelf of her kitchen pantry, lost her balance, and came down hard on the tile floor. The paramedics who responded found her conscious but shaken. The X-rays showed a hairline fracture in her wrist. Nothing catastrophic, the doctor said, but the fracture was a warning. Eleanor lived alone in the family home, the same house where she had raised 3 children after her husband Raymond passed away from a heart attack when the kids were still in school. The house was paid off. Eleanor was proud of that. She had worked 30 years as a bookkeeper to make sure of it. That house meant everything to her. Martin Patterson was the oldest of Eleanor's 3 children. He had left for college when Diane was barely in middle school, built a career in corporate finance, and settled with his wife Sandra in a suburb outside of Atlanta. He had the kind of life that looked perfect from the outside, the right job, the right address, the right car in the driveway. He and Eleanor spoke on the phone. He visited at Christmas when the timing worked. He was not what you would call an absent son, but he was not what you would call a present one either. There was something between Martin and Eleanor that had always been slightly complicated, a mixture of unspoken expectation and quiet distance that neither of them ever really addressed. But he was her firstborn, and Eleanor had never completely shaken the particular tenderness that mothers tend to reserve for whoever came first. Carol Patterson Webb was the middle child. She had married young, moved about 4 hours away to the suburbs of Charlotte, and built her life around her husband and 2 daughters. Carol called Eleanor on Sunday evenings, a habit she had developed in her 20s that she maintained, more or less, into her 40s. The calls got shorter over the years. The visits became annual events, carefully scheduled around school holidays and family commitments. Carol was not a cold person. She loved her mother in the way that many adult children love their aging parents, from a distance that feels manageable, punctuated by guilt that flares up and then quietly settles back down. She was not cruel, but she was absent, and in the years ahead, her silence would cost Diane more than she could have imagined. And then there was Diane. Diane had never moved far from home. She had her own apartment about 20 minutes from Eleanor's house, close enough to stop by on a Wednesday evening just because she felt like it. When the fall happened, and the doctor started talking about follow-up appointments and physical therapy, and the need for someone to check on Eleanor more regularly, it was Diane who rearranged her schedule first. It was Diane who drove Eleanor to the follow-up appointments. It was Diane who noticed, about 3 months after the fall, that Eleanor was forgetting small things, misplacing her keys, repeating the same question twice in the same conversation, leaving the stove on. These were the kinds of things that are easy to dismiss in isolation, but when you are watching them add up week by week, they stop feeling small very quickly. By the time Eleanor turned 72, Diane had made a decision that she has described in the years since as both the most natural and the most costly choice of her life. She gave up her apartment. She moved into the family home. She told her nursing employer that she needed to step back from her position. She was not dramatic about it. She did not frame it as a sacrifice. She simply looked at the situation in front of her and did what she believed needed to be done. Her mother was slipping, slowly but unmistakably, and there was no one else positioned to catch her. Martin sent a text saying that was really wonderful of her. Carol called and said she felt terrible that she could not do the same thing, and then both of them went back to their lives. What followed was not a short chapter. It was 10 years. 10 years of medication management, doctor appointments, dietary adjustments, sleepless nights, and the particular exhaustion that comes from watching someone you love gradually become a different version of themselves. Eleanor, in her early years of decline, still had good stretches, days where she was sharp and funny and entirely herself. Diane lived for those days. She kept a routine. She made Eleanor's favorite meals. She played the old records Eleanor loved from the 1970s. She took her mother to church on Sunday mornings and sat beside her in the pew they had shared since Diane was a little girl. It was not easy. It was not glamorous, but it was love in its most concrete and unglamorous form. Martin sent money twice during those 10 years. Both times, Diane had reached out first. The first time was in year 3, when Eleanor's medication costs increased significantly after a change in her insurance coverage. Martin sent a check. It covered about 2 months of the shortfall. The second time was in year 6, when Diane needed to hire a part-time home aide to help with Eleanor's increasing physical care needs. Martin sent another check. He also sent a card that said he did not know how Diane did it, and that Eleanor was lucky to have her. Carol contributed nothing financially across the entire decade. She sent flowers on Eleanor's birthday and a fruit basket every Christmas. She was not trying to be cruel. She simply, and this is the part that would take years for Diane to fully reckon with, did not see what Diane was carrying as her problem to solve. In year 7, Eleanor's diagnosis changed. What had previously been described as mild cognitive impairment was reclassified as early-stage dementia by her neurologist, Dr. Harmon, after a series of evaluations at the regional medical center. It was not a shock to Diane. She had been watching the trajectory for years. But there is something about hearing the word officially spoken in a clinical setting that shifts everything. Eleanor was 78 years old. She still recognized Diane. She still knew the names of her grandchildren. She could still hold a conversation about the past with remarkable clarity, but her short-term memory was deteriorating steadily. She became more susceptible to fear, to confusion, to the kind of anxiety that surfaces in people who can sense that something inside them is changing but cannot fully articulate what it is. She needed more, and Diane gave more. This is where the story takes a turn that Diane did not see coming, because around the same time that Eleanor's diagnosis changed, Martin started calling more frequently, not to ask about Eleanor's health, not to inquire about whether Diane needed more help or more money. He started asking about the house, about the will, about what financial arrangements Eleanor had made and whether all of her paperwork was in order. Diane thought little of it at the time. Martin was a finance man. Organization and documentation were the language he had spoken his entire career. She assumed he was being practical. She assumed he was thinking about logistics. She had no reason. In those early conversations, to assume anything darker than that was before the visit. Martin arrived on a Friday evening in the spring of Eleanor's 70th year. He had not given much notice. He came with Sandra, his wife, and told Diane they just wanted to spend some time with Eleanor and give Diane a break for a few days. Diane was grateful. She took the opportunity to run errands she had been postponing for weeks. She met a friend for dinner for the first time in months. She slept past 7 in the morning for what felt like the first time in years. It felt, briefly, like exactly the kind of relief she had been quietly hoping one of her siblings would offer. She did not know, in those few days, what was happening inside the house while she was away. She would not find out until much later, and when she did, she would not be able to stop thinking about those errands she had run and that dinner she had attended while her mother sat across a restaurant table from a stranger in a suit. The business card was in the pocket of Eleanor's blue cardigan. Diane found it on a Sunday when she was sorting laundry. It was a cream-colored card, slightly bent at one corner. The name on it was Glenn Marsh. Below the name were 2 words, estate planning. Diane held the card for a moment. She turned it over. There was nothing on the back. She brought it to Eleanor and asked, as gently as she could, who Glenn Marsh was. Eleanor looked at the card and said that Martin had taken her to lunch. That it had been very nice. That Mr. Marsh was a perfectly pleasant man. Diane asked what Mr. Marsh had helped with. Eleanor said that Martin had told her it was important to get things organized, and that Mr. Marsh was helping with that. Then Eleanor asked Diane what was for dinner, and that was the end of the conversation. Diane called Martin that evening. She asked him, directly, what the meeting with Glenn Marsh had been about. Martin said it was nothing to worry about. He said he had simply encouraged Eleanor to update her estate documents because she had not reviewed them in years, and it was the responsible thing to do. He said he had told the attorney that the house and the assets should be handled carefully given that Eleanor's health was changing. He said everything was fine. He said Diane did not need to be involved because it was really just a formality. Diane told him she wanted to see whatever had been drawn up. Martin said he would look into it. He did not look into it. He stopped returning her calls about it within the week, and then he went back to Atlanta. Diane asked Eleanor directly if she could see the updated will. Eleanor became agitated in a way that was unusual for her. She told Diane she was being paranoid. She told her that Martin had been trying to help, and that Diane was making it into something it was not. It was the kind of response that felt rehearsed, not entirely Eleanor's own words, but words that Eleanor was repeating in Eleanor's voice. Diane recognized the difference. She had been living with her mother for 7 years. She knew how Eleanor sounded when she was speaking from her own mind, and how she sounded when she was reciting something that had been placed there by someone else. But she had no proof. She had a business card, a vague conversation, and a feeling in the pit of her stomach that she could not shake and could not yet name. Carol called Diane 2 days later, not to ask how Eleanor was doing, not to offer to come down and help. She called to tell Diane, in a voice that was measured and slightly rehearsed, that Martin had explained what he had done and that she thought it was a good idea and that Diane needed to stop making it into a bigger deal than it was. Diane asked Carol if she knew what was in the new documents. Carol said she had a general sense of it. Diane asked Carol to tell her what was in them. Carol said it was not her place to say, and that Diane should just trust that the family was being taken care of. That was the moment Diane knew. She did not know the specifics yet, but she knew. She hung up the phone, sat down at the kitchen table in the house she had been living in for 7 years to take care of a mother who could no longer take care of herself, and she understood that something had already happened, and that whatever it was, it had happened without her. Eleanor's final months were difficult. The dementia had progressed considerably by the time she turned 79. There were more bad days than good ones now. She sometimes did not know what year it was. She sometimes called Diane by the name of a sister who had passed away 20 years earlier. She needed help with most daily tasks. She was not in pain. She was not unhappy, but she was diminished in ways that were hard to witness if you had known her in her full strength. Diane stayed. She stayed through the confusion and the repetition and the nights when Eleanor would wake at 2 in the morning and not be sure where she was. She hired additional part-time help and covered the cost herself when the savings ran short. She did not call Martin to ask for more money. She had stopped expecting things from Martin by then. Eleanor Patterson died on a Tuesday morning in January. It was peaceful. Diane was holding her hand. She had been at her bedside through the night, having sensed sometime around midnight that the end was near. Eleanor's breathing had changed. The rhythm had shifted. Diane knew what it meant. She was a nurse, after all, even if she had not practiced in years. She held her mother's hand and talked to her quietly through the night. She told her that she was loved. She told her that she had been a good mother. She told her that Raymond was waiting. Eleanor did not speak. But at some point, in the early hours before dawn, something in her face relaxed in a way that Diane has described as the most complete peace she had ever seen on another person. And then she was gone, and Diane sat alone in the room for a long time before she called anyone. Martin's phone call came 6 hours later. Diane had barely slept. She had made the necessary calls, had spoken with Eleanor's doctor, had sat on the back porch of the family home for a while just breathing. When Martin's name appeared on her phone, she answered it expecting a grieving brother. What she got was a logistics manager. He wanted to know when the attorney reading would be scheduled. He wanted to know if she had contacted the funeral home yet. He wanted to know what was in the house in terms of valuables and whether anyone had done an inventory recently. He did express condolences, about 45 seconds of them, and then he moved directly into his list of questions. Diane answered them flatly and ended the call as quickly as she could. She sat back down on the porch and stared at the bare winter trees in the backyard and tried to prepare herself for what was coming. By the time Martin and Carol arrived for the funeral, Diane had been managing every arrangement alone for 4 days. She had coordinated with the funeral home, selected the casket, written the obituary, notified Eleanor's remaining friends, organized the reception, and arranged for Eleanor's church to host the service. Martin and Carol both cried at the funeral. They greeted the guests warmly. They told stories about their mother that were true and tender. From the outside, it looked like a grieving family united in loss. But by the second day after the service, Martin and Carol were moving through the house with the kind of focused, methodical energy that had nothing to do with grief. They were photographing furniture. They were opening closets and looking through boxes. Martin asked Diane where Eleanor kept her financial records. When Diane asked why, he said they needed to be organized for the estate process. He said it like it was obvious. He said it like she should have already known. The reading of the will was scheduled for 6 days after Eleanor's death. Attorney Glenn Marsh's office was in a beige building in a business park at the edge of town, the kind of place that looked like it handled mostly quiet transactions for mostly ordinary people. The 4 of them sat in a conference room. Martin and Carol sat on one side of the table. Diane sat on the other. Glenn Marsh sat at the head. He was a soft-spoken man in his 60s with reading glasses and a measured delivery that gave away nothing. He explained that he would be reading the most recent version of Eleanor's will, executed 18 months prior. Diane noticed the word recent. She noticed the phrase most recent version. She pressed her hands flat against the table and made herself breathe. The original will, the one Eleanor had drafted years earlier with a different attorney, had divided the estate into 3 equal parts, 1 for each child. There had been a note in it acknowledging Diane's caregiving role and expressing Eleanor's gratitude. It was not a monument to fairness, but it was a recognition. The revised will that Glenn Marsh read aloud in that conference room bore no resemblance to that document. The family home, the paid-off house in which Diane had lived and worked and sacrificed for 10 years, was left entirely to Martin. Eleanor's savings account, a modest but meaningful sum accumulated over 30 years of careful bookkeeping, was left entirely to Carol. And Diane was left what the document described as the personal effects of the home and a mother's gratitude for her service. Her service. 2 words, as if the last 10 years of her life had been a job she had applied for and agreed to perform and been adequately compensated for in the form of gratitude. Diane asked Glenn Marsh when exactly the document had been signed. He gave her the date. She did the mental arithmetic in less than 3 seconds. Eleanor had been showing cognitive symptoms for at least 4 months before that date. Diane knew because she had been there. She had been in the room. She had been the one calling Dr. Harmon when Eleanor's confusion became a daily occurrence rather than an occasional one. She had been the one filling out the forms, tracking the medications, speaking with the specialists. She knew the timeline better than anyone in that room. And she knew that the woman who had signed her name to that document 18 months ago could not have been the woman who had raised her, the woman who had stayed up with her when she was sick as a child, the woman who had built a life worth anything at all on nothing but determination and love. Martin did not look at Diane when Glenn Marsh finished reading. Carol looked at the table. Nobody said anything for a moment. And then Martin, in a voice that was almost offensively calm, said that he hoped Diane understood that Eleanor had simply wanted to make sure the house stayed in responsible hands, and that he intended to honor that wish. He said he knew it was hard to hear, and that he hoped they could all move forward as a family. Diane looked at him for a long time. She did not cry in that conference room. She told Martin that she had some questions about the timeline and that she would be in touch. She gathered her things. She walked out to the parking lot. She sat in her car for 20 minutes. And then she drove to the public library because the family home no longer felt like hers to sit quietly in, and she used the library's computer to search for the name of a probate attorney. What Diane learned in the weeks that followed was both clarifying and deeply painful. She learned, from speaking with her own attorney, that contesting a will on grounds of undue influence or lack of testamentary capacity was not a simple process. She learned that the burden of proof rested on her. She learned that the courts would look at the totality of the circumstances, the medical records, the timeline, the testimony of witnesses, and make a determination about whether Eleanor had possessed the mental clarity required to execute a legal document at the time she signed it. She also learned that her situation was far from unique. That this kind of thing, a vulnerable elderly person, a sibling who saw an opportunity, a quiet visit to an attorney, a will that rewrote a lifetime, happened far more often than most families ever admitted out loud. That knowledge did not make it easier, but it made her feel less alone in it. Diane contacted Dr. Harmon directly. She explained the situation. She requested copies of Eleanor's medical records going back 2 years before the will was signed. Dr. Harmon, who had cared for Eleanor for nearly 8 years, was cooperative and thorough. The records told a story that was impossible to misread. Clinic notes from 3 months before the will was executed included flagged concerns about Eleanor's cognitive function. There was a notation indicating that Eleanor had repeated the same question multiple times during a routine appointment. There was a recommendation for a full neurological evaluation. There was a follow-up note indicating that the evaluation had been delayed. And there, in Dr. Harmon's careful clinical handwriting, were the words that would eventually be read aloud in a courtroom. Patient demonstrates progressive cognitive decline consistent with early to moderate stage dementia. Functional independence compromised. Capacity for complex decision-making questionable. Diane hired probate attorney Linda Cho, a sharp and methodical woman who had handled will contests for 15 years. Linda reviewed the medical records, interviewed Diane extensively, and then did something that Diane had not anticipated. She reached out to the part-time home aide who had worked in Eleanor's home during the period in question. Her name was Rosie, and she had been coming 3 mornings a week for almost 2 years before Eleanor's death. Rosie had watched Martin's unannounced visit unfold from the inside. She had been in the house on the afternoon when Martin had taken Eleanor to lunch with Glenn Marsh. She had noticed that Eleanor, upon returning, was quiet in a way that felt unsettled rather than content. She had heard Martin, on the phone, late that evening when he thought no one was nearby, telling someone on the other end that everything had been taken care of. Rosie agreed to provide a statement. She was not a dramatic woman and not a person inclined toward conflict, but she had grown fond of Eleanor across those 2 years. She had watched Eleanor be confused and frightened on days when her mind was not cooperating, and she had watched Diane hold her through those moments with a patience and tenderness that Rosie said she had never forgotten. She felt, she told Linda Cho, that she owed it to Eleanor to tell the truth about what she had witnessed. Her statement described Martin's behavior during that visit with a specificity that was difficult to dismiss. The closed-door conversations, the unaccompanied trip to the attorney, the way Eleanor had seemed unable to fully explain or recall what she had agreed to afterward. It was not a smoking gun, but alongside the medical records, it was a pattern. And patterns, Linda told Diane, were what courts were built to recognize. Martin responded to the notice of the will contest by retaining a litigation attorney from Atlanta, a firm with a polished website and an impressive list of corporate clients. They sent a cease and desist letter within 2 weeks. The letter characterized Diane's challenge as emotionally motivated and legally without merit. It accused her of attempting to override their mother's clearly expressed final wishes. It suggested that Diane's decade of caregiving had, in fact, given her undue access to Eleanor and undue influence over her affairs, a move that Diane's attorney described as a textbook reversal tactic. Carol did not retain separate counsel. She stopped communicating with Diane entirely. Her last message to Diane was a text that said simply, "I hope you know what you're doing to this family." Diane kept the text. She saved every communication from that point forward. She had learned, by then, to document everything. The probate proceedings took 14 months. 14 months of filings and depositions and hearings in a courthouse 40 minutes from the family home. Diane attended every session. She sat in the same chair each time. She brought her folders of documentation. She answered questions from both sides with the precision of someone who had spent a decade tracking medications and appointments and the minutiae of another person's daily existence, and who had never, in all of that time, stopped paying attention. Dr. Harmon testified. Rosie testified. Eleanor's longtime neighbor, a woman named Mrs. Briggs who had known the family for 30 years, testified about a conversation she had had with Eleanor during the final summer of her life. A conversation in which Eleanor had looked at her, lucid and frightened in equal measure, and said that she hoped she had not made a terrible mistake. The testimony that shifted the case most decisively, however, was not from any of the witnesses Diane had identified. It came from inside the family home. 3 months into the probate proceedings, Diane was going through a box of Eleanor's personal items that had been stored in the back bedroom closet, items she had not yet been able to bring herself to sort through. Inside the box, beneath a stack of old birthday cards and a small photo album, was a Bible. Eleanor's Bible, the one she had carried to church every Sunday for 40 years. And tucked inside the front cover, folded in thirds, was a handwritten letter. The handwriting was Eleanor's. It was shaky in places, the hand of someone whose motor control was not entirely reliable, but it was unmistakably hers. Diane unfolded it and read it standing in the middle of the bedroom floor. The letter was undated. It had no salutation. It began simply, in Eleanor's voice, saying that she had not been herself for some time and that she knew it. It said that Martin had come to see her and had told her things about Diane that had frightened her, that Diane was planning to use the house for herself, that Diane had been making decisions without asking Eleanor, that Diane could not be trusted with the estate. It said that Eleanor had believed him because she was scared, and because her mind had been playing tricks on her, and because Martin was her son and she had always trusted him. It said that she had signed something because he told her she needed to, and because a man in a suit had sat across from her and told her where to put her name. It said she was not sure what she had signed. It said she was sorry. It said she hoped Diane would not hold it against her. Linda Cho moved immediately to have the letter introduced as evidence. The opposing counsel challenged its admissibility, arguing that an undated, unwitnessed letter could not be authenticated. The judge allowed it, ruling that the letter's specific references to documented events, its handwriting consistent with Eleanor's authenticated signature, and its content corroborated by independent witness testimony, gave it sufficient evidentiary weight to be considered. The letter did not, on its own, overturn the will, but it did something arguably more powerful. It reframed the entire proceeding. It shifted the question from whether Martin had benefited from changes to the will, which he plainly had, to whether Eleanor had acted out of her own free and informed will, which the totality of the evidence now strongly suggested she had not. The judge's ruling came on a Wednesday morning in October. Martin's team had argued, up until the end, that Eleanor had been legally competent at the time of signing, and had made her wishes known freely and deliberately. They produced a declaration from Glenn Marsh stating that Eleanor had appeared oriented during the meeting and had not exhibited signs of confusion in his presence. Linda Cho countered with Dr. Harmon's records, Rosie's testimony, Mrs. Briggs's account, the medical literature on how individuals with early to moderate dementia often perform better in brief, structured interactions than in their daily lives, and Eleanor's own letter. The judge, a quiet man with a reputation for meticulous written decisions, ruled that the evidence, taken as a whole, established sufficient grounds to conclude that Eleanor Patterson had lacked testamentary capacity at the time the revised will was executed, and had been subjected to undue influence by a party who stood to benefit materially from the changes made. The revised will was invalidated. The original will, the one that split the estate 3 ways, equally among all 3 children, was reinstated as the governing document. Martin filed an appeal. The appeal was denied 8 months later. The family home, the home that Eleanor had paid off over 30 years of meticulous, determined bookkeeping, the home that Diane had lived in for a decade to make sure her mother never spent a single night alone and frightened, was determined to be jointly held by all 3 siblings pending resolution of the estate. Carol did not attend the final hearing. Martin attended with his attorney and said nothing to Diane on his way out. There were no scenes. There was no confrontation. There was only the sound of a door closing and a hallway emptying, and Diane standing at the top of the courthouse steps in the October air, breathing. There is something important to say here about what Diane has expressed in the years since the ruling. She has been asked, more than once, whether she fought the case for the money, and her answer has always been the same. She did not fight it for the money. She fought it because her mother's name was on that document. Because Eleanor Patterson had spent her entire adult life making careful, deliberate, considered decisions. As a bookkeeper, as a widow, as a mother raising 3 children on a single income. And the last legal document bearing her name was a fabrication built on fear and confusion, and the manipulation of a woman who no longer had the full capacity to protect herself from the people she loved most. Diane fought because the truth deserved to be the truth. She fought because silence, in this case, would have meant agreeing that what happened was acceptable, and she was not willing to agree to that. Martin kept his career. He kept his house in Atlanta. He kept his wife and his reputation, more or less intact in the world that he moved through. Carol kept her distance. She has not spoken to Diane since the ruling. She sent a card about a year after the proceedings ended, a brief, opaque note that acknowledged that things had become difficult between them without assigning any responsibility for how or why. Diane kept the card. She keeps most things. It is a habit born from 10 years of medical records and medication logs and appointment calendars. The habit of a woman who learned, the hard way, that documentation is the only language that certain rooms are equipped to hear. She is still living in the family home. She repainted the kitchen in the spring after the appeal was denied. She said it needed it. What this story asks us to sit with is not comfortable. It asks us to look honestly at what families do when the stakes become financial. It asks us to consider how easily love can become transactional, how quickly the person who gave the most can become the one with the least protection, how a decade of devotion can be rewritten in a single afternoon in a beige office building by someone who saw a window and decided to step through it. It asks us to think about Eleanor, not only as a victim, but as a woman who was frightened and confused and manipulated by her own child, who tried, in the last clear moments available to her, to leave a record of what had been done to her. She folded that letter and tucked it into her Bible because somewhere, beneath the confusion, she still knew that the truth mattered. She was counting on someone to find it. She was counting on Diane, and Diane did not let her down. If you are still watching this, drop a candle in the comments, one single flame, for every person you know who gave everything to a family that took even more the moment it became convenient. You would be surprised how many candles will appear. And if this story moved you, if it sat with you in a way that you were not expecting when you clicked play, then you already know what to do. Subscribe to this channel. We tell the stories that do not get told anywhere else, the ones that happen behind closed doors, inside families, inside the spaces that are supposed to be the safest places in the world. The next story we are preparing will make you question something you have never thought to question before. We will see you there.